Greetings, everybody. My name is Mark Nutter. I'm the Conservation Program Director at New Hampshire Audubon. I just want to thank you so much for deciding to spend some time with us this evening, and we'll get started. I would like to first acknowledge that I am talking to you near our state headquarters in Concord, New Hampshire, which is located within the ancient village of Pennacook in Nadakina, which is the traditional ancestral homeland and waterways of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. I would like to acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and our ancestors, the Alnambak, or human beings, who have stewarded Nadakina throughout the generations for thousands of years. And I invite you to learn more about the indigenous presence on the land you occupy by visiting the website native-land.ca. Here you can see and click on territories of indigenous people and get connected to more educational resources. And for a more in-depth understanding of the Granite State, check out all the incredible resources available at indigenousnh.com, including this particular story map, which details the history of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, specifically here in New Hampshire. These resources, among others, have helped me recognize the ongoing consequences of colonialism for all people of color and the need for change in our current society. Thank you again for your interest in tonight's topic, Flowering Trees and Shrubs for Pollinators by Emma Erler, Field Specialist and Commercial Horticulture at New Hampshire Cooperative Extension, or University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension. As you all may know, this evening's talk is our 6th session in our 12-month-long speaker series called Exploring Connections to and Stewardship of the Natural World, the past recordings of which you can find on our YouTube page and our Exploring Connections series webpage. Throughout this series, we're exploring the intersection of the sciences and humanities, finding and forging new ways to connect with the natural world and importance of conservation action. This particular talk is the second of 7 pollinator conservation themed presentations. These pollinator experts and community scientists are presenting on such topics as native bees, beneficial predatory wasps, nocturnal pollinators, and tonight, the native shrubs and trees they need to survive and thrive. However, before I hand it over to Emma for tonight's presentation, I would like to take this opportunity to briefly describe how this webinar fits into the larger mission of New Hampshire Audubon. For those of you who don't know, New Hampshire Audubon is a state-based environmental nonprofit organization that is completely independent from National Audubon. We rely on members and donors like you to support our charitable mission, which has 4 pillars: connecting people to nature through environmental education experiences like school programs, nature day camp, and webinars like these; researching and conserving species in peril, including large raptors and small birds; managing about 10,000 acres of wildlife sanctuaries throughout the state for habitat and recreation; and finally, advocating for sound environmental policy in the New Hampshire State Legislature. I am here today because of donors and members like you. We are also supported by a huge network of over 2,000 volunteers across New Hampshire that assist us with wildlife monitoring, ambassador animal care, environmental education, and wildlife sanctuary management throughout the state. If you are a volunteer, member of supporter of New Hampshire Audubon, I would like to sincerely thank you. We simply couldn't achieve our charitable mission without you. If you would like to become a part of our conservation family, which I hope you will, please check out our website for ways to get involved. We are super impressed with the turnout for tonight's evening, so much so that we had to upgrade our Zoom account recently to accommodate the 145 registered attendees. We're also streaming this live on Facebook to accommodate all the people who are interested in learning alongside us this evening. For those of you in the Zoom webinar, please feel free to use the chat for any thoughts, comments, or reflections that you might have. For fun, just try to type in the chat where you're watching this presentation from. It's been great to see the vast geographies that we've been able to reach through these webinars. And so that others can see your response, just first change where you're sending that message to from the default all panelists to all panelists and attendees. And tonight we'll be using the Q&A button for any specific questions as they arise. And I've set the parameters to allow other attendees to view the questions so they can comment or even upvote the questions that they want specifically answered. I imagine that we'll have more questions that we'll have time for. So this upvoting helps us hone in on which questions that we spend time on. And Diane will do her best monitoring the Facebook live chat and ask them on behalf of the audience when we come to that point at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Diane DeLuca, our senior biologist at New Hampshire Audubon, who has been critical in orchestrating these webinars and the great speakers she's lined up. Diane has been with New Hampshire Audubon for decades and currently splits her time between managing the demonstration pollinator gardens at our state headquarters in Concord, tracking phenological changes at our Deering Wildlife Sanctuary, and helping manage the establishment of a 1-acre pollinator meadow from seed over the next few years in the fields adjacent to the McLean Center. And Diane will introduce tonight's speaker and handle the Q&A.
Thanks, Mark. I'm excited to introduce Emma Erler. Emma is the landscape and greenhouse field specialist for UNH Cooperative Extension, and she has been with Extension's horticulture programming since she joined in 2017. Her career prior to Extension is rich in public horticulture and education, from internships at Longwood Gardens and the Morris Arboretum, both in Pennsylvania, to positions at heritage museums and gardens in Sandwich, Mass, and Tower Hill Botanic Garden in Boylston, Mass. As a field specialist, Emma's primary role is providing research-based programming and technical assistance to green industry businesses throughout the state, including nursery, garden center, and landscape operations, while also serving the broader agricultural community of Hillsborough County. Emma also shares her expertise regularly on WMUR's Grow It Green gardening feature and through a weekly gardening column, as well as through workshops, courses, and new programs. And we're thrilled to have her with us tonight. Her presentation is on flowering trees and shrubs for pollinators and wildlife. Welcome, Emma.
Well, thank you, Diane and Mark, and thank you even more to everybody who's turned out tonight. This is a subject that I'm really excited to talk about. I love talking trees and shrubs, and I'm going to cover a whole bunch of trees and shrubs that you might consider for your own properties towards the end of my presentation. So I'm going to give you ideas on plants that grow really well in certain scenarios, whether you have sun, whether you have part shade, whether you have a wet soil, a very dry soil, and also some of the critters that you could expect to be attracted by these plants. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. And like mentioned before earlier, if you do have questions as we go along, feel free to put those in the Q&A. We're going to have lots of time at the end to go over those, so don't worry. All right, so to start off with, I'd love to hear a little bit from all of you on what your criteria are for selecting trees and shrubs for your landscapes. Is it for multiple seasons of interest? If you're really looking for the ornamental features of plants, the flowers, interesting bark, fall color, etc. B, whether you're looking for something that doesn't have many pest or disease issues, just looking for things that are native to New Hampshire, or plants that are good for forage, for pollinators and wildlife. So if you just want to put A, B, C, D, whatever in the chat, I'm just going to take a peek at that and see where you're all coming from. So a good diversity so far. A lot of people saying A and D, which is fabulous. In case you're wondering, while these answers are coming in, I'm kind of scanning. The plants that you're seeing on your screen right there, you're seeing a swallowtail butterfly on buttonbush, plant I'm going to talk about more. Really showy flowers on Acusa dogwood, which is not a native. That's actually native to China. Chipmunk, of course, on a hickory nut, and river birch, which is a really popular landscape tree, often grown as a multi-stem specimen. Okay, so a lot of people, it seems, are saying A and D. So those multi-season interests, so flowers, interesting bark, fall color, awesome. I'm looking for those things too. And forage for pollinators and wildlife, also fabulous. And of course, native to New Hampshire. A lot of the plants I'm going to focus on are indeed native to New Hampshire. If it's not, I'm going to tell you. And I'm only going to really focus on just a couple of plants that aren't native to New Hampshire at all. So thank you all, folks, for that. I appreciate it. And with that, so my focus tonight is really going to be on native trees and shrubs that have high landscape value. So meaning they have a lot of really attractive ornamental features, and they're fairly easy to grow as long as you put them in the proper location. And they're beneficial to pollinators and other wildlife. A lot of the plants I'm going to mention have flowers that are attractive for pollinating insects, and then later on might produce fruits that will be eaten by birds or small mammals, or they provide really good nesting habitat for birds or good cover. All right, so some of the benefits of native plants. Well, first and foremost, it's that wildlife value. When you grow plants that adapted to a specific habitat, let's say our ecosystems in New Hampshire, the wildlife adapted right alongside that, or rather, evolved to be able to use those plants in their life cycles. So there's a lot of studies that have been done on whether native wildlife prefers native plants, and indeed it does. Native birds, certainly native insects, all of our pollinators tend to prefer native plants. Now the exception there is the honeybee, which is not native to North America. The honeybee will forage on just about everything, but a lot of the native pollinators do have a preference for native plants. And certainly if we're talking about completing a life cycle, so we think about this in particular with butterflies and moths who feed on the foliage of plants in order to complete their life cycle. Many of these are dependent on a particular plant species or genus. Now, the monarch butterfly is a classic example because it's dependent on just one genus of plant, the milkweed. Of course, I'm not going to talk too much about milkweed tonight because I'm talking about trees and shrubs, but it's a really good example of an insect that is absolutely reliant on just one group of plants. And the other caterpillar you see on your screen right there is actually a snowberry clearwing moth. So also called a hummingbird moth. You've probably seen these in your garden before in the summer. They actually look like tiny miniature little hummingbirds buzzing around. This insect feeds on just a few trees and shrubs in order to complete its life cycle, one of those being its namesake, the snowberry. Oh, hold on a second, I'm accidentally annotating. All right, some of the benefits of natives. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but first and foremost, these are adapted to local climate and growing conditions. So inherently, you tend to have fewer issues with these plants because they're already well adapted to our climate. So let's say New Hampshire, if we're talking about climate, most of the state is going to fall into either zone 5 or zone 4 USDA hardiness zones. And I'll talk about that a little bit more going on. But most of these plants, you don't have to worry about giving them extra winter protection as long as they're planted early enough in the season, early enough that they become well established, or at least their root system becomes well established. You shouldn't have to worry too much about winter hardiness, which is really important. You also shouldn't have to worry about putting down too much extra irrigation. Most of these plants are adapted to local rainfall conditions in New Hampshire. Of course, we just came off of an exceedingly dry year, and we're starting off with another really dry season this year. But in general, you don't need to be putting in a full-blown irrigation system for natives. They do tend to have fewer disease and pest issues as well. Again, because these plants are hopefully healthy and well adapted to where they're being planted, they're better able to fight off or at least tolerate some disease and insect pressure. And then finally, most natives really aren't going to require much in the way of fertilizer. If you're really trying to get a plant to speed up its growth, then maybe a little bit of fertilizer is helpful. But in general, it's not something we need because our soils in New Hampshire are going to have everything that these plants need. One more benefit here is that you're really supporting local ecosystems and potentially creating habitat corridors. That picture on the left is not New Hampshire, but anybody who lives here knows that our habitats are getting increasingly fragmented with human development. So all sorts of new houses, new shopping complexes, what have you, going up in the state. Every time we develop a piece of land, we're potentially eliminating wildlife and certainly pollinator habitat. We know that bees in particular are in decline when we're talking about pollinator decline. And a lot of this is due just to habitat loss. There aren't as many places for them to forage anymore. Invasive species are taking over and native plants are losing out. So that important forage on important host plants have disappeared. And climate change has some broader implications as well. So planting natives in our landscape can definitely help native insects. All right, so I've been talking about native plants a whole bunch, but what even is a native plant and how do we define it? There are actually lots of definitions out there, but most of them have at least one common theme through them, that we're talking about plants that originated in a region or ecosystem before Europeans arrived in North America. So this is pre-Columbian plants. Now, how do we define it in our landscapes though? So on your screen here are a couple of plants that are pretty much always considered native. And if you go to your garden center, or if you're shopping a catalog or going online, these plants right here, the redbud and the serviceberry, are both going to be listed as native plants. Now, what we have to decide is whether we indeed consider these plants to be native to New Hampshire or whether we don't. So the redbud, eastern redbud, you can see the range map that's on your screen right here that I took from the Native Plant Trust. This indicates, the green indicates where this plant is native, where this small tree is native. Purple's where it's non-native, and if it's white, means that plant does not grow here in the wild at all. So eastern redbud is not a plant that you're going to find in the wild in New Hampshire. It's just not going to happen. The only way you're going to find it is if, I'm just going to delete this little spot here that I accidentally done. Yeah, if you find this in New Hampshire, it's going to be growing where it was planted. So somebody purchased that plant and put it in the landscape. I have never found a seedling redbud in New Hampshire. It just isn't quite adapted to grow here. So, is that a bad thing? I would still consider this native because it's a North American native. I'm not anticipating it becoming a nuisance in our climate. And if anything, as our climate continues to warm, redbud may actually be better suited to our climate than it is to some of the southern locations where it's currently found or where it is historically grown. So I think it's perfectly fine. It's a plant I'm going to talk about a little bit more, but it's technically not native to New Hampshire. Whereas in exchange here, the serviceberry, at least Amelanchier canadensis, which you see on your screen right now, this one is native to New Hampshire. You can see that green range map, pretty much the whole East Coast, you can find this plant growing wild. So if you go out to a forest edge, there's a good chance that you're going to find serviceberry. So yes, this one is a New Hampshire native. So if you're really a purist, and if you say native means plants that grow wild in New Hampshire, serviceberry is going to be your plant. One more question here. Can native plants be invasive? This is a question I've gotten a few times before. And the answer is actually yes. If we expand our definition of native plant to be something that's, or if we're saying native plant is something that's native to all of North America. Black locust is actually a really good pollinator plant, but it's a plant that's considered invasive or at least not native throughout most of the Northeast. In New Hampshire, it's considered quasi-invasive. It's not prohibited. You can certainly plant this tree, but because it suckers so readily and it can take over woodland areas, it is considered more of an invasive threat. So I guess the answer to that question is yes, if we're saying a North American native plant, not a New Hampshire native plant, it can potentially be invasive. So you won't see anybody selling black locust trees at the nursery. You might be able to buy seedlings somewhere online. And it is a really valuable pollinator plant, but it is considered invasive. All right, when we're talking invasive shrubs, invasive trees, it's going to be really important because we're adding these to our landscape that we are choosing the right plants based on the site conditions we have on our properties. If we put the proper plant in the proper place, then that plant's going to be really happy and healthy without a whole lot of added irrigation or a lot of added fertilizers. We're not going to have to be worrying about picking pests or worrying about disease too much, as long as we're really basing our choices off of the conditions that plants require. So to start off with here, we might as well talk about the soil conditions. This is something that you should be aware of before you purchase any plant. And you can figure this out pretty easily by going into your yard or your landscape and just digging up some of the soil and feeling its texture. Or looking at, the habit of the soil after you get a rainfall. If there's an area of your property where the water always puddles after a rainstorm, where the soil is always kind of mucky or just consistently wet, that's a good thing to know. If there's other spots where it seems to dry out really quickly after you get a rain, that's probably a well-drained site, and it's going to be appropriate more for droughty or drought-tolerant plants. And if it's somewhere in the middle that has good organic matter and it drains readily, but also tends to hold on to moisture, then we'll call that a medium moisture plant. The ideal garden soil is going to be that. It's going to hold on to moisture, and it's going to have a good amount of organic matter in it. So if you already have a really nice garden soil, you're going to be able to grow just about everything. If you have a very dry, sandy soil, then you're going to be a little bit more limited in what you can grow, what's going to be really successful. And if you have a heavier wet soil, then you're really only going to want to choose plants that are adapted to wetland conditions and wet soils. You'll also want to take stock of what the sun exposure is in an area where you're looking to plant. You'll want to know whether that site gets 6 or more direct hours of sunlight a day. That's kind of the cutoff for me, what I consider full sun. So if an area gets 6 or more hours of full direct sun a day, I'd say that's a full sun site. If we're looking at less than that, let's say 4 hours or so of direct sun, then I would probably call that part sun or part shade. And if we're looking at an area that's pretty much getting shade the full day, maybe just only an hour or two of direct sun and then just dappled shade or shade the rest of the day, then we're looking for shade loving plants. Most of the trees and shrubs I'm going to talk about are going to be happiest in full sun to part shade. There isn't really a whole list of super pollinator friendly plants that like deep, deep shade. Just a few herbaceous plants here and there that will tolerate that. Not a lot of trees, flowering trees and shrubs. Noting hardiness is key too. I imagine most of the people that are tuned into this webinar are probably from New Hampshire. And if you're a gardener, you probably know which USDA hardiness zone you live in already. But in general, if you live in the southern half of New Hampshire, it's pretty safe to say that you are in zone 5, which means that the average annual extreme minimum winter temperature falls, no further than -20. If you're in the northern part of the state, then you can assume that you're in zone 4, unless you were very far north and you might fall into zone 3B. If you are trying to choose a plant that you're not going to have to worry about at all in terms of winter hardiness, go for a plant that's ranked lower, a zone lower or 2 lower than where you are currently located. So if you live in zone 5, you can know that you're going to be pretty safe if you're growing zone 4 or zone 3 plants. If you live in zone 5 and you're growing zone 5 plants, there's a chance that there's going to be winter injury. And that really comes into play when you're pushing the envelope with things like flowering dogwood or the redbud that I mentioned earlier. I mentioned before that a lot of native plants don't have as many pest or disease issues. I just want to highlight that's not always quite the case. Eastern hemlock, which is a really great plant. Obviously, it's a wonderful evergreen tree that has a lot of benefits to wildlife. I don't recommend planting it in landscapes anymore because of the invasive pest, the hemlock woolly adelgid. Similarly, I often don't recommend planting some of the native viburnums in landscapes anymore because of a European pest called the viburnum leaf beetle that will skeletonize the leaves, pretty much defoliate the plant. unless you're using some sort of pesticide to control it. So this would include things like cranberry bush viburnum, arrowwood viburnum. Those two are particularly hard hit. And though they are really great pollinator and wildlife plants, I skip them at this point, at least in landscape settings, just because I don't want to have to pull out pesticide to keep that thing healthy. And then deer browse. So I'm sure many of you have issues with deer in your landscape. The plant that's on your screen right there is Eastern Arborvitae, which is a native evergreen, at least native to Eastern North America. Deer absolutely love it. So not the best choice for a screen in your landscape. It's not going to do a lot for pollinators or wildlife anyways, but it's just something to keep in mind. Some of you who kind of have your ear to the ground when it comes to native plants have probably heard the term nativar before, so I'll mention it now. Nativars are basically cultivars of native plants. So let me back up for a second. A cultivar is a cultivated variety of a plant. That means that gardeners or horticulturists have selected a native plant that has particularly ornamental characteristics. So perhaps it has larger fruits or fruits that are a different color, as in the case of winterberry winter gold. The plant that's over here on the left side of your screen, on the left-hand side, that's what a native winterberry looks like. On the right-hand side, that's what winterberry winter gold looks like. It has these unusual yellow fruits. With nine bark, which is a really popular shrub for landscapes and shrub borders, the native species, just straight species, has a flat green leaf, but there are lots of funky cultivars out there that have red leaves or chartreusey green leaves. And these obviously don't represent what the wild plant will look like. And sweet pepper bush or clethra. Wild plants are pretty much always going to have these white blooms. If you grow ruby spice, you might have these really nice pink flowers. Now, what's going on here? Some of these, strange leaves, interestingly colored flowers, berries, some of these were bred specifically by horticulturists. Some of these came from sports. So just a random wild plant that had a mutation that had these funky colored flowers or funky colored leaves. A lot of these were specific, these traits were specifically bred for. Now, what are the implications in terms of, pollinators using these plants, of wildlife using these plants? I can say anecdotally that the straight species winterberry is definitely, or at least its berries, are used by songbirds as a food source before some of these larger fruited or abnormally colored fruited varieties. Now, that's not to say that birds won't eat that fruit at all. They just don't go to it as readily. And it really becomes more of a survival food over the winter because they won't touch it otherwise. It's really just when they get very desperate, they'll switch to that food. In terms of pollinator use and some of these other plants, so the nine bark and the sweet pepper bush, I'm not overly concerned about pollinators using these plants. As long as the flower still has the functional reproductive parts and is still producing nectar and pollen, pollinators are going to use it. Now, whether it's as good of a larval host plant is kind of up for debate. And there's definitely research that's being done on whether some of the nativars are still good quality for pollinators. If you want to really maximize the chances that wildlife, that pollinators are going to use a plant, grow the straight species. If you're really trying to up the ornamental value of your garden, I'm not a purist by any means, and I think it's totally fine to plant nativars in your landscape. These plants definitely still have value, and they are going to contribute more to your landscape than any introduced plant from Asia or Europe. Okay, so our objectives here. This is the last thing I'm going to focus on before we switch over to talking about some of the plants that you might try growing in your landscape. I do think it's important before you start just buying native plants to put in your landscape, particularly trees or shrubs, that you have an idea of what you're trying to accomplish in the landscape. Number one, you need to know how much space you have and plan accordingly based on the mature size of the plant. I'm going to give you rough estimates on how big plants are going to get, so you can jot that down and think about whether you have the space for it. But a classic mistake when it comes to trees and shrubs is people putting these plants far too close to buildings or too close to each other, so that the plants get overcrowded or they become an issue maintenance-wise in the future. So I like to treat trees and shrubs as being permanent fixtures of the landscape, and I like to plant them in places where they're going to have plenty of room to grow. There are also some design things you should keep in mind too. You know, if you are trying to grow a hedge, let's say, or something for privacy, then you'll probably pick one native over another. The native in your upper right-hand corner is inkberry, which is a native holly, one that is really not common in New Hampshire. You're not likely to find this in the wild, but it is native to New England, and it's a really nice evergreen plant that's often used for screening or for hedging. You might also be thinking about putting in a tree for shade, in which case you could be growing all sorts of very large shade trees like oaks or maples. You could also be thinking about supporting, let's say, butterflies through their whole life cycle. So that's where planting something like the spice bush, which that's spice bush swallowtail caterpillar that's in your upper left-hand corner of your screen. That particular insect feeds on, you guessed it, spice bush. So if you want to have more of those butterflies around, or if you really want to support them, growing spice bush on your property is going to be key. And of course, if you're really interested in feeding wildlife, attracting birds, then growing things that produce fruit as well as flowers for pollinators is going to be key. All right, so I'm going to ask you again to just put in the chat, true or false here, whether non-native plants can have benefits to pollinators and wildlife. I'm just kind of curious what you folks think. Yes, I'm saying true for some, you bet. Yes, but not the best choice. True, true, true. Yes, but depends. Awesome. Okay. Well, you folks are thinking along the same lines as me, that yes, true, non-native plants can have benefits to pollinators and wildlife, but it is a bit conditional. So there are certain plants that have really, really excellent value for pollinators. They might produce a lot of nectar or pollen, let's say, or they might produce fruits that are consumed by wildlife. Yeah, in this case, some of these plants are great. The ones that I'd say that are producing fruits that aren't an issue in the landscape are the ones that haven't proven to be invasive anywhere in the United States. So kind of the first example I have of that is crabapple or apple. Crabapples, apples, their parentage actually comes from the Middle East and Central Europe. So these are absolutely not native to North America or New Hampshire. There are a lot of what we call wild apples out there that descended from plants that homesteaders would have put in, you know, a couple hundred years ago. And these do seed in, but they're not considered a nuisance in the landscape. They are, however, really, really valuable. They are an excellent source of nectar and pollen early in the season. So early bees, certainly honeybees use these a lot, but native bees that are out early will use these for forage as well. And the fruits that crabapples produce are also attractive to a variety of songbirds. I often see robins in the crabapple that's near my own home. So good food source there, often a late winter food source. And there's a lot of diversity here. So there's really a crabapple to suit everyone's taste for the landscape, all sorts of different sizes, anywhere from a 6-foot weeping variety to a 30-foot, you know, large crabapple like Donald Wyman. Lots of different flower colors. That's not going to impact pollinator use too much. Lots of different leaf shapes and colors too. Again, not going to have much of an impact on use at all. So I would say choose a plant that's going to fit in your landscape, and definitely try to choose a variety that is disease resistant, because crabapples and apples are definitely susceptible to some fungal diseases that can really diminish the ornamental value of the plants. Washington hawthorn, this is another one of those non-native plants that actually provides a lot of good benefits to pollinators and certainly wildlife. The particular variety, Winter King, I think is one of the best for the landscape because it's largely thornless and it only gets to be about 25 to 30 feet tall. So it fits into that small tree category that a lot of homeowners are looking for. It blooms in May. So if you have one of these, it's probably blooming now or it just finished blooming. And this also produces a fruit that's very similar to a crabapple. These plants are pretty closely related when you look at plant families. This fruit too is a good winter food source for birds. The flowers are definitely good forage for bees. In terms of native plants or something that you might already have on your property that you don't even need to buy and plant, black cherry is definitely noted as one of the best plants for native insects. It has flowers that come out in early, well, I should say mid to late spring, early summer. So if you don't see this in your property now, you're probably going to see it soon. This is a really good source of pollen, also a good source of nectar. So a lot of bees will use this, including bumblebees, mason bees, sweat bees. It also produces these fruits later in the season that again are a really excellent food source for a lot of wildlife. And it turns out that actually a huge percentage of the seed bank that's in forested ecosystems is actually black cherry seeds. So this is often one of the first plants that shows up when you log an area or clear an area, which is kind of interesting. This is also a really important host plant for a number of butterflies and moths. So kind of the whole package here. Perhaps not the most attractive plant that you could have in your landscape, and I wouldn't recommend it if you're trying to grow, let's say, plums or ornamental plums in your landscape, because it is alternate, or it is a host for the disease black knot. But if you don't have those, just looking for a really, really excellent wildlife and pollinator plant, keep the black cherry on your landscape or maybe transplant one. Basswood is also another really good one. So the basswood you're going to find growing in New Hampshire is Tilia americana, the American basswood. You find this growing in rich soils typically. So I often see it along rivers, along streams, definitely more towards the Connecticut River Valley. This is definitely one of the best forage plants for bees, and beekeepers absolutely love this tree because bees get a ton of nectar from the flowers. It's actually really fragrant too. Basswood, or at least American basswood, is a huge tree. This can grow up to 60 feet tall. So this is not something for the small landscape. If you have a smaller spot, you might grow Tilia cordata, heartleaf Tilia, which is not native, but it's also really good for pollinators. Black Tupelo, also called black gum, Nyssa sylvatica. This is a tree that you often find growing near wetlands or along the edges of lakes and ponds in New Hampshire. Has really, really fabulous fall color, which you can see displayed on your screen right here. Has these glossy leaves that turn a really brilliant orange or red. This is going to top out typically between 30 and 40 feet. So it's not a massive tree for the landscape. And it does have small flowers that produce nectar that are definitely attractive to both short and long-tongued bees. And it produces fruits that are enjoyed by birds and small mammals later in the season. You could try eating these fruits too, although they're quite tart and I don't think all that enjoyable. But Black Tupelo, I think, is definitely an underestimated tree. This is one that grows well in a wetter soil, so wet or consistently moist soil, because this does tend to grow in more of a wetland scenario. This will be best in full sun. Red maple. So this is a plant that is wind pollinated, another native that is actually surprisingly really valuable to bees, particularly bumblebees and honeybees. This plant produces a lot of pollen. So bees that are searching out pollen, particularly those bumblebees that need pollen for their nesting, are going to be able to use red maple quite a bit. It's also beautiful. That red fall color, can't be beat, and it's appropriate for a variety of landscapes. Anywhere that has a medium to wet soil, red maple is going to do really well. I probably wouldn't put it in a dry soil site though, because it really is more adapted to having more moisture. And full sun to part shade's ideal. White oak I put on here. not so much because it's really a good forage plant for pollinators, but it's a really, really important host plant for a whole bunch of native insects, including a bunch of native moth species. So worth keeping around, worth planting. This is actually one of the best native street trees that I know of. So if you're looking to put something next to the road, this will work. It's very salt tolerant, it's compaction tolerant, will grow nice and compact if it's in full sun. And of course, the acorns that it produces are very popular with many wildlife species. Here's that red bud that I mentioned earlier. This is native further south. And this one's really, I mention it because it's a really attractive flowering tree. And it does produce some nectar that can be enjoyed by pollinators that are out early. This has probably already wrapped up blooming in your landscape if you have one of these, or it's starting to be on its way out. Blooms really early. But that's really what it offers. The leaves too will sometimes be used by leaf cutter bees. So if you ever see a round cutout in a leaf, along the edge or margin, it's probably a leaf cutter bee that's using that leaf section for nesting. One thing I should note about redbud is that it is more susceptible to winter damage. So I would probably really only try growing this tree if you're in zone 5. And if you do plant it, you're going to have to make sure that it's really well established before you get to the winter. So I would be inclined to plant it in the spring. I would be watering it consistently and mulching the root system heavily in the winter to try to get it through that first winter when it's going to be most vulnerable. But it is a really nice landscape plant and worth considering. Serviceberry, which I mentioned earlier, is another early bloomer that is native to New Hampshire. Again, good source of pollen and nectar for bees that are out early, particularly those bumblebees, maybe mason bees. And this one does produce fruits that are also really attractive to a number of bird species and other mammals. People can eat this too, although the berries are very tart, but it can be pretty nice as a preserve. Serviceberry too doesn't like a real dry soil. If you have a nice medium soil and sun to part sun, that's going to be ideal. Here's that spice bush that I mentioned earlier. This is another one that blooms before its leaves are out. So this is probably already wrapped up blooming. At least it has in my area. This is the host plant for the spice bush swallowtail. So if you want to have that butterfly around, this is a good one to plant. Also, good forage for insects that are out early. And the fruits that this plant produces, which you'll notice more in late summer and into the fall, are a really important food source for migrating thrushes. It's actually higher in fat and protein than most other berries. So it's an excellent food and energy source for a lot of songbirds. A lot of the shrubby dogwoods too are going to be good choices. These, if you're looking for native ones, would include gray dogwood, red twig dogwood, and silky dogwood. The fruit color is going to vary a little bit. Twig color, the exact character of the flowers might vary. The flowers, of course, are going to be used by pollinators. Those fruits are going to be used by birds primarily. This is a great plant for a wetland margin or anywhere where you have a wetter soil on your property. It can be a really nice hedge. What often happens when these are grown ornamentally in landscapes is that they are pruned really hard in order to enhance the character of those stems. So red twig dogwood, for example, is often cut to the ground every other year or so that you have these really straight red canes. The only thing I would caution you about if you're trying to grow this plant for pollinators or for wildlife is that when you do that hard pruning, you're not going to get flowers, or you're going to get very few, and you're not going to get very much fruit production. So if you're really trying to have this plant be the absolute best ecologically, you don't want to prune it very much. You really just want to let it grow in its natural form. Maybe just a little bit of light pruning here and there, removing no more than about 1/3 of the stems so that you're still getting those flowers and fruit. Winterberry, which is another one I'm sure a lot of gardeners are familiar with. This is touted probably as one of the best native plants for landscapes because it is tolerant of a variety of conditions. You'll get the most fruit if you put it in a full sun location, but it will grow in part shade as well. It will tolerate a really wet soil, but it will also take really dry soil. So really tolerates the gauntlet here and produces these really beautiful berries that are not only attractive, but are also good for birds. The flowers, which come earlier in the season, are very, very small, but this is an insect pollinated plant. So definitely will get bees visiting it. If you want to have these fruits, just so you know, you are going to need to have both a male and female plant. Like other hollies, winterberry, it is a holly, let me mention. The plants are either male or female, and you need to have both in order to get pollination. And winterberry just happens to be a deciduous holly. So usually when we're thinking hollies, we're thinking evergreen things in our landscape. But the hollies that we have that are native to New Hampshire lose their leaves in the winter months. Red chokeberry or black chokeberry, Aronia. This is another plant that's in that rose family, like the apple, like the hawthorn, another early bloomer that's providing good early forage for pollinators. This one is another one that produces fruits too, that are going to be enjoyed by a variety of wildlife species. This doesn't get all that big, so this is going to be something that typically doesn't exceed about 4 feet or so. So it works in a lot of shrub borders where people aren't looking for a really big plant. This plant right here is another one that I'm kind of stretching the limit of what we consider native. This is a plant that you'd probably be seeing native from New Jersey south, fragrant sumac. Looks a little bit like poison ivy, but trust me, it is not. It doesn't cause any sort of rash or anything like that. Not poisonous in any way. And this does produce flowers, which aren't particularly valuable pollinators, but it does produce fruits that are really more of an emergency food supply for a variety of wildlife. Why am I mentioning it? Because I think it's one of the best native plants that you can grow to stabilize a really sandy, gravelly hillside or bank. It also has really beautiful red fall color, which makes it worthwhile to plant. Sweet pepper bush, also known as, I think, summer sweet, is Clethra alnifolia. This is a New Hampshire native, and this is a plant that you will typically find growing in wet areas. So along rivers or streams, certainly along ponds or lakes. This usually is somewhere in the range of 3 to 6 feet tall and is going to grow best if you have it in a moist or medium soil. This one blooms in summer, so July, August. So a lot of these plants that I've already mentioned bloom early in the spring or early in the summer. This one extends that season. So if you're trying to have good forage for pollinators, planting this shrub in your landscape is going to give them another option when a lot of the other trees and shrubs have finished up blooming. This one does spread by suckers. So you'll plant one plant, if it's happy, you're going to get a whole bunch of new shoots that come up from the base. So a lot of people don't like it for formal landscapes. I don't like it for formal landscapes, but I think it's really nice in shrub borders otherwise. Virginia rose, one of the native roses. Another option is Carolina rose or swamp rose. These roses don't really produce much nectar, but they produce a lot of pollen. So you'll see a lot of bees using these, a lot of native bees that are collecting pollen for their egg laying. We'll definitely be visiting rose plants. And then those hips, so the fruits that roses produce later in the season, those are probably used by mammals more than anything in the wintertime when food is getting scarce. And these provide just good cover too for birds. Buttonbush Cephalanthus occidentalis. If you have a full sun site that's pretty wet or at least has medium moisture, this is a really awesome plant to grow for butterflies. It's visited by long-tongued bees as well, but definitely something that you'll see swallowtails on, or at least I always see swallowtails on. This is a native wetland plant in New Hampshire, and it has these really interesting flowers that again bloom more in that midsummer period. So you'll see this blooming in June, maybe even into July. So a nice shrub in that regard. Kind of coming to the end here, I want to make sure we have time for questions. Black elderberry is another one that's worth growing. A lot of people grow this because people can eat the flowers. You can fry them up. You can also make nice cordials or jams out of the fruit. Of course, a lot of animals enjoy that fruit too. And the flowers are a nice nectar source for both long and short-tongued bees. And those flat-top flowers are a nice landing spot for butterflies too. And I also see flies and beetles and all sorts of wasps. So other insects that we often don't focus on as pollinators, but that do indeed pollinate plants will definitely enjoy black elderberry. And this is often a shrub that robins and catbirds will nest in too. So it's worthwhile for a number of reasons. And I should note too that the black elderberry, this is something that's going to grow best if you have a consistently moist soil. So this would be good to put near the edge of a pond or a stream. High bush blueberry, we all know this plant because we enjoy the fruit so much. So no brainer, that fruit's beneficial to wildlife. The flowers, which are, this plant's in bloom right now, I think are really beautiful and interesting. They're definitely utilized by long-tongued bumblebees and to a certain extent by honeybees too. So it's a good forage plant. It's high in nectar. It also has really lovely fall color. So that lends itself to landscapes as well. Not something to put in a real dry area of the landscape. You also don't want to put it in soggy, wet soils. That in-between range is ideal. Nine bark, I mentioned this plant earlier, really common for shrub borders, perennial borders and landscapes, lots of different foliage colors. These flowers bloom in early summer, and they are definitely used by both the long and short-tongued native bees. So you'll see a lot of activity on this. And I have definitely noticed that sphinx moths will use this as a host plant. So if you ever have one of these defoliated, look for sphinx moth caterpillars. And inkberry. This is that evergreen shrub that I mentioned. And I could mention other evergreens too. Some of the native rhododendrons and azaleas are also nice for pollinators. But inkberry is definitely used by bumblebees at least. And those fruits are used later in the season. These nice black fruits. It's probably one of the best native evergreen hedges or screens that I can think of that will tolerate partial shade. And then just kind of a final thought here. If any of you already have perhaps some invasive plants in your landscape, you might think about replacing some of those. So one of the classics is the burning bush, which you see over on the left. It's a plant that you may have inherited when you bought your property. You may have planted it when it was still in vogue a couple decades ago. Really doesn't provide any benefit to pollinators at all. It might give a food source for some songbirds, but they're only going to end up spreading it somewhere else. And its fruits are not going to be any better than that of high bush blueberry or red chokeberry or winterberry, any of the natives. So in terms of some replacements, if you're obsessed with that red foliage and you want something that's going to be a little bit better ecologically, Fothergilla, which is a shrub I didn't mention that's native to witch hazel and has a white bottlebrush flower, is great. That red chokeberry, nice red fall color, and high bush blueberry, nice red fall color. The only problem is that those three native plants do like a rich, moist soil, whereas the burning bush will just grow in absolute garbage. So you probably won't be able to put the high bush blueberry in the really dry, gravelly soil. Same with the other two, but you can integrate these in other parts of your landscape. If you still have Japanese barberry and you really like that reddish foliage, you could also try some of these plants that I already mentioned. Nine bark is a great choice for that. Fragrant sumac also has that really nice red fall color. Sweet pepper bush I mentioned, not so much as a direct replacement, but just because it is so good for butterflies and bees late in the season. And it is about the same stature as that barberry. And then the Norway maple. A lot of people are loath to cut these down because it might be the biggest shade tree in your landscape, but they really don't offer any benefits. You know, maybe some nesting habitat for birds, but you could get that too with red maple, red oak, black gum, white oak, any of the native trees. So if you can stomach it, I would replace this plant with something that's going to be a bit better. And with that, I would love to answer any questions that you folks have. And I will just point out here too, that I put my email address on the lower right of your screen here. If you have questions that we don't get to tonight, feel free to reach out to me directly. Happy to answer. Native plants, native trees and shrubs, topic that I am always happy to talk about. So definitely feel free to reach out. With that, I'm going to stop share so you can see my face a little bit easier. And I'll have Diane
Thanks, Emma.
prioritize some questions for me.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. That was great. I think I'll just start the questions playing off your last couple of slides. And that is, there was a question on what is your definition of invasive?
Great question. Yeah, so plants that are considered invasive didn't originate in North America typically. So these are plants that come from a different continent. So in our climate, that usually means Western Europe or Central Europe in some cases, or Asia. So plants that did not evolve here, and they don't have any natural predators or enemies in our habitat. And so a lot of times they do have a competitive advantage because they can grow without restraint, and they tend to take over natural areas. They spread quite readily. So there are a lot of garden plants that aren't invasive. I think it's actually, I've been told before that 1 in 100 plants that's been introduced to our landscape turns out to be invasive. So the vast majority of landscape plants, things that you might pick up at the garden center that aren't native to New Hampshire, aren't going to be considered invasive. We're worried about the ones that spread readily on their own and then take over natural areas. So that definitely is the case with burning bush. It spreads beyond where you planted it, and it can take over forest understory. With the Norway maple, that spreads by seed too, and it will end up crowding out a lot of native plants. So it doesn't provide any benefits particularly to native pollinators, to native wildlife, and it crowds out a lot of native plant species, which we know are really important to native wildlife and pollinators. So we want to, in our natural areas, we want to keep those, you know, growing with our native plants instead of things that came from overseas. All right, I'm
Sorry,
actually,
Emma, I was muted, but somebody asked.
no, you're okay. I was like, I'll just.
Somebody asked about honeysuckle and said the birds love it, but is that okay? I know some of them are invasive.
Yeah, so most of the honeysuckles that you're going to find on your landscape or in natural areas are not native. There are a couple of native honeysuckles, but they're very low growing and they don't produce a ton of fruit. So honeysuckle fruit is definitely eaten by birds, and it can be a good food source for a lot of birds. Again, the problem is that this is a plant that spreads. So when birds eat those seeds and poop out or eat the fruit rather and poop out the seeds, when that plant grows, it doesn't have anything that's restricting its growth. So there aren't any insects feeding on it. Most herbivores like deer and rabbits aren't going to eat it either. So it can just take over an area. And you'll definitely see bees visiting honeysuckle flowers. You'll definitely see birds eating the fruits. The bigger issue is just how it spreads and how it can really take over. So there's a whole bunch of species. They kind of get lumped together as the bush honeysuckles. A lot of these came from Asia, or a few came from Europe as well. So in general, not so good. Something I'd look at replacing.
Here's an interesting question. Do you know of a tool that helps you choose a shade tree to shade a house and not a roof that has solar panels on it? Mature height is easy to find, but that doesn't indicate how far from the house to plant.
Yeah. So height obviously is helpful to know. It's also good to look up the spread of a plant. And a resource I would recommend using if you don't have, a perennial plant guide or a tree and shrub guide is the Missouri Botanical Garden. It's a free resource. They have pretty much every landscape plant that you could possibly think of listed on their site, which includes the natives, it includes introduced species, and they'll give you an idea of the height and spread range for a plant. So for example, a red maple might be listed as growing, let's say 50 to 60 feet tall with a spread of maybe 30 to 40 feet. So looking up that spread, you know that you don't want to plant it any closer than 40 feet to the house, or else you're going to have issues with shading on those panels later on. So that's just something to look up. Not always listed on resources. A lot of times just the height is focused on, but Missouri Botanical Garden is where I would look for that information. It's going to be good, reliable information about the plant.
Sounds great. So another question about resource. Is there a resource to help choose varieties of crabapples and other species that are better in New Hampshire for wildlife?
In New Hampshire specifically, I would say no. We do have an older fact sheet that I don't think is live on our website anymore that looked at disease resistance in crabapple. So the majority of the crabapples are going to be plenty hardy enough in New Hampshire. I would be considering the fruit size in terms of the wildlife that you want to support. If you're hoping to feed birds, then I would choose a variety that has very small fruits, let's say, a dime or less in diameter. If you're hoping to give deer, let's say, something to eat, you might go for the larger fruited crab apples, which, maybe are an inch in diameter or so. The big thing I would be looking at is lists of crab apples that are disease resistant. The big disease that really impacts the aesthetics of crabapple is called apple scab. And it will completely defoliate a tree that's not resistant. I'm thinking of one of the best lists I've come across online is from the Morton Arboretum. So if you were to Google Morton Arboretum, disease-resistant crabapples, you'd come up with a whole list of plants. And it's also, that site, I believe, too, is going to tell you the size of the plant, the flower color, the leaf color, growth habit, etc. So it's worth doing your homework there because it can be a bit overwhelming. There are literally hundreds of crabapples, and there's going to be probably a dozen or more varieties at your local garden center to choose from.
So Emma, here's another interesting question. Are nurseries forbidden from selling invasives?
They are, yeah. So in New Hampshire, there is the list of prohibited invasive species, which Norway maple, burning bush, and the Japanese barberry are all on. So nurseries can no longer sell those plants. It's actually not technically legal for homeowners to be moving those, propagating those either. So you're not supposed to be planting these in any capacity because they're known to be such an ecological threat. There is also a list of plants on the restricted invasive species list or the invasive species watch list. And that's a big list of plants that have proven to be invasive in other parts of the country and have the potential to be invasive in New Hampshire. So there's no rules or laws in place at this point that says you can't sell or buy these things in New Hampshire. For example, Vinca minor is on there, periwinkle. So we know that it can spread into wild areas. We know that it can be an issue in landscapes, and it is considered invasive in other places. But you can still purchase it and you can still plant it. And you can look up that list of prohibited invasive species too. It's on the New Hampshire Department of Agriculture's website. And most of the plants on there are going to be things that are just weeds, but definitely those ornamental landscape plants are on there too.
And there are a number of questions about good places to purchase native plants.
Oh yeah. One of the great things is that so many more people are interested in native plants now that you're seeing a lot of garden centers purchase more of them, or maybe even set up a whole section for native plants. So I would absolutely check out your local garden center first. There are a couple of nurseries in New Hampshire that focus specifically on native plants. I don't know how much they grow with trees and shrubs. That might be a little bit trickier, but you could check that out. I usually avoid mentioning names, but if you were to do a Google search, you'd come up with a couple of places that sell native plants in New Hampshire. And there are also catalog sources too. So there are a few companies that specifically just sell native plants, a few of which sell trees and shrubs. And I think I saw somewhere in the chat there, somebody added Fedco, which is out of Maine. And the New Hampshire State Forest Nursery sells a whole bunch of native trees and shrubs as well. That sale is wrapped up for the season, but might be something worth checking out next year. So get your orders in early. Usually the catalog comes out in December. So it's something to shop early.
A number of people, and you kind of shared some of this out as you went through your program, but they're interested in what grows well in poor soil. Like, what are some of the key shrubs that might grow well in poor soil? And what grows well in partial shade for native trees and shrubs, like on the north side of a home?
Great. Yeah. Poor soil is challenging. It is, because a lot of plants just aren't going to thrive. So if you have a very dry, sandy soil, which I'm well familiar with, there's a shorter list of things that are really going to do well. So, one thing you could think about is trying to amend your soil with organic matter so that it has better water holding capacity. That's a huge undertaking and something that you're going to have to do every single year. You're going to have to be adding compost to the garden every year because it breaks down, disappears, and then you're back to where you started. If you don't really want to mess around with trying to amend the soil in your landscape, then I would be looking at things that are really drought tolerant already, or things that you would find growing in areas that have poorer soil. So, be thinking about the plants that you see growing under the power lines typically. Things that come to mind for me for really poor soils that grow well. One is that fragrant sumac that I mentioned earlier. So it's that shrub. There's a cultivated variety called Grow Low, which is more appropriate for most landscapes. But the straight species is nice too. It's a bit taller. That's a good one. What's another one? Hazelnut is another nice one that does quite well in dry, sandy soils. So you can get away with that. Witch hazel too. So the native witch hazel is Hamamelis virginiana. You're not likely to find that at a garden center. You'd probably have to dig one up and transplant it into your landscape. But you could, at a garden center, probably find vernal witch hazel, which is native to the southeastern states in North America and blooms in spring versus the native that blooms in the fall. If you have a sunny spot, you could grow juniper as well. The native Juniperus horizontalis does well in dry soil, has fruits that'll be eaten by some animals. Low bush blueberry does pretty well. And a lot of the native trees and shrubs will do okay in that scenario. So you could certainly be growing oaks in a dry, sandy soil. You could be growing sugar maples or silver maples. Basically what you're going to expect is just a slower rate of growth than if you put them in the perfect garden soil. But yeah, absolutely still possible. And for shady spots, most of the plants that I mentioned tonight would grow fine in a shady spot. In general, deciduous plants, so plants that lose their leaves in the winter, are going to be more shade tolerant than evergreen plants. So things with needles, needled evergreens, I should say. Rhododendrons, the native rhododendron, like Rhododendron maximum, is nice for shady locations. And that's like full shade. That plant will do okay. You could definitely be growing something like the redbud. That's a native understory tree. So that does well in shady spots. A lot of the others that I mentioned. So if we're talking, let's say, about the clethra, that sweet pepper bush, the blueberry, the buttonbush, any of those, You could put those in a partly shaded location. What you should expect though is just fewer flowers and fewer fruit. If they're in full sun, it's going to be covered with blooms and you're going to get all sorts of fruits. If it's in a shadier location, it just won't be as productive. You'll get a lot more foliage. So, you know, that can be perfectly okay. But I would be thinking more along the lines of things that are a bit more of an understory plant. So I guess in addition to that, if you're looking for the maximum characteristics of that plant. So witch hazel that I mentioned before would be great. Certainly the redbud would do just fine. I think spice bush would be a nice choice too for a partly shaded location.
Great. So somebody asked, where is it okay to dig up native plants like witch hazel?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So if you're going to do that, you can do it on your own property. You can certainly dig up plants and move them. If you had landowner permission, let's say a friend who has some of those plants has, let's say a witch hazel, it would be fine to dig that up. Technically not okay to be digging up a plant that's just on the side of the road, that's on somebody else's land. I wouldn't be doing that. And you definitely won't be trying to dig that sort of stuff up in any sort of parkland or state land. So ideally, if you have some woods, go out and look for these plants. There's a good chance you're going to find them, or see if a friend has them. Another option too is trying to grow some of these things from seed. That is how the State Forest Nursery grows their plants in Boscawen. So you could collect fruits or you could collect seeds and you could try sowing those. I know that that's a bit more of a project than many people are probably interested in, but it's totally possible and totally doable.
Emma, one more question about, is there a native ground cover you'd recommend?
Ooh, yeah. So if you're talking woody plants, then if we're in a really dry, sunny spot, I'd be thinking about that horizontal juniper, or I might be looking at bearberry, which is a kind of a low-growing evergreen. That's nice. Low bush blueberry is also a really nice ground cover, and you can actually buy it as sod sometimes because people like to put it down as a ground cover. If you have let's think of some other woody things. Another nice one is deer villa, which I am blanking on the common name for that, but that's a honeysuckle relative that has really nice flowers that can be grown in a sunnier part shade location. There are also tons of native herbaceous plants too that could potentially be ground covers. One of my favorites is spotted geranium maculatum. That does really nicely if you have just like a consistently moist soil, although it will take some drought. So that's one to look at. Canada anemone is another one that sometimes people think is a nuisance because it can spread so much in gardens, but that's also another nice native ground cover. If you have a shadier location where you're looking to maybe get rid of some lawn and put in a no-mow alternative, Pennsylvania sedge is something worth looking at. And that's a plant you might have to order, but it's not a grass, it's a sedge, but it's a really nice fine textured plant that has yellowish green foliage that only grows about a foot tall. That is really lovely. You've probably seen it hiking in the woods before and didn't pay it any attention, but when it's grown in masses as a ground cover in shady locations, it's quite lovely.
That's great. There were a couple of specific questions, like somebody asked about whether serviceberry has other common names.
Yeah, one of the other common names for serviceberry is shadbush or shadblow. I learned it as serviceberry, so I call it that. But those names are valid too.
And another participant said that their serviceberry has an infection where the leaves are all curled up, and they were wondering what they might be able to do.
Ooh, could be something fungal. I'm not absolutely certain. What I would say is if you could take some pictures of that plant, so from afar showing the whole plant, some close-up pictures of the leaves, maybe even a picture if there's a transition area where some are healthy, some are looking sickly. Take pictures of those and either email them to me at emma.erler@unh.edu or email them to just our general inbox, which is answers@unh.edu. I don't even want to guess without seeing what's going on, because I almost always am imagining something that does not reflect reality.
Emma, this is probably a fairly complex question, but in general agricultural practices, how can we control invasive population over nativars?
Okay. So, sorry, over nativars or native?
Well, they said nativars, but I would say native plants.
Native plants, okay. Ooh, that's tough. I mean, the best thing you can do is keep the soil covered. So trying to have as many a healthy native plant population as possible. Usually where native plants come in is where you have disturbed soil. So let's think of like the abandoned farm that's typically clogged with invasives, or edges where there's a lot of sunlight and maybe a bit of disturbance. You don't typically find invasives when you're in, a deeper forest setting, or even where you have a really dense coverage of native plants. So let's say really healthy native grasses or wildflowers. There might be a few here or there, but it's not completely taking over. Or if you have, a really dense, healthy stand of native shrubs. So, trying your best to avoid disturbing a site. So doing as little site work as possible, doing as little mowing as possible, and putting in native shrubs or native perennials, trees, whatever, where you can, where you do have disturbed land or disturbed soils, because that's where the invasives are going to come in. And unfortunately, the cat's kind of out of the bag on invasives, so they are going to continue to come in. But my advice, at least for the home landscape, is to, pick an area where you're going to battle invasives. You may not be able to get rid of all of them on your property, but even just choosing, one particular little section of your property or one edge where you just decide, nope, nothing's going to become established here invasive wise. So you're pulling up those seedlings once they come in, and you're planting as many wild plants as possible or native plants as possible to cover that soil and potentially outcompete the invasives that are coming in. It's tough. It's going to be an ongoing battle, but it's worthwhile. It's a lot of effort, but certainly a good thing from a pollinator perspective and a wildlife perspective.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks for all the great questions. I think maybe we'll wrap it up with this last question, and that is, are there any like native evergreens that you would recommend in the landscape that would be good for wildlife?
Oh, great. Yeah. So a lot of the native evergreens are probably going to be used by small mammals, so squirrels, chipmunks, and some birds that are eating seeds from the cones. Of course, cover too, so nesting sites and cover. Not so much pollinators. So native evergreens, needle evergreens anyways, aren't going to be used by bees or butterflies really. Ones that I would recommend, white pine is always a strong choice. You can definitely, buy white pine at nurseries, and you can buy more compact varieties, but I think it's a great plant and worth putting in. Some of the native firs and spruces will work too. So you might try red spruce or black spruce, or you might put in, let's say, balsam fir, which you'll find growing more often in native or northern New Hampshire or higher elevations. But it's that classic Christmas tree, and that's a nice plant too. The trick with at least the spruces and the balsams is that they aren't always super happy to be in our hot, dry, exposed landscapes, and they can have more issues with pests, certain insect pests and diseases, if they aren't real happy in the landscape, if it's too dry, if it's too hot. So if you're looking for something besides that white pine, I would often actually opt for some of the non-native evergreens, just because they do hold up a bit better in the landscape, and you don't have to worry about dealing with something like an insect pest like, or I should say arthropod pests like spider mites, or some of the fungal diseases that are an issue. So like Serbian spruce is nice. White fir holds up pretty well in landscapes. There's a whole list, but unless you definitely have a rich, moist soil, I would be wary about planting a whole lot of balsam fir.
Great. Thanks, Emma, for such a great presentation. Really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us tonight. And thanks everyone for joining us. We have another presentation coming up next week with Vicki Brown on Pollinators 101, and that I'm sure will be very informative and a wonderful presentation as well. So please take a look at our Exploring Connections page on our website and join us again. As Mark already mentioned, we have another few pollinator talks coming up through June and into July. So we appreciate everyone joining us tonight. And we will be sharing out this presentation. It was recorded. So in a few days, you should be getting a copy of the YouTube presentation, as well as some resources that Emma wanted to share with everyone who participated. So thanks.